You've constructed all this on my father's land? That's impossible. The county sanctioned everything. Sanctions don't transfer ownership. We've held the deed since 1964. No, that can't be. Someone would have informed me. I'm informing you now. The first time Ronald Easton became aware of the bulldozers, it wasn't the noise that caught his attention. It was the vibration, the kind of tremor that travels up through the soles of your feet and settles deep in your chest. As he stood at the edge of his porch, with coffee in hand, he watched as a colossal yellow machine churned over the wild grass his father had once faithfully tended every Sunday morning. His land, his father's land. 10 acres that had belonged to his family for over half a century, until this very moment, apparently. The roar of the engines attempted to drown out the memories, but it was a futile effort. He could still vividly picture his father, Ernest Easton, kneeling by the fence line, hammering in new posts after a storm. His father's words echoed, "Never let anyone take what's yours." His hands, weathered with calluses and pride, held that lesson. Ronald remembered those words like a sacred vow, but that morning, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm down there demanding answers, nor did he even contact the police. He just stood perfectly still, his eyes steady. Like a man observing a storm, he had already learned how to survive. "Morning, Mr. Easton," one of the younger workers shouted, waving from the tractor as if this were just another mundane neighborhood project. Ronald didn't return the wave. There was no need. He knew this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was theft masquerading as progress. From the corner of his vision, he saw the sign that had appeared overnight, future site of the Rowan Village Center. A community investment project. The name, printed in bold, audacious letters, made his stomach tighten into a knot. Rowan. He recognized that name. Jeanette Rowan, president of the local homeowners association. Sharp suits and even sharper words. She was the kind of woman who governed the street like it was her own personal kingdom. People either admired her or avoided her entirely. Ronald did neither. He barely tolerated her. He took another sip of his coffee, his gaze still locked on the construction. "My father's land," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for his own ears. Inside his house, framed photos stood sentinel on the mantel. His parents, his grandparents, and even an old black and white photograph of the farm before it was subdivided into residential lots. He walked over and gently touched the corner of one frame. His mother's handwriting was faint on the back. Easton Acres, 1965. That land was far more than just property. It was history. It was his family's proof that they had built something that would last, in a place that had once told them they didn't belong, and now that very proof was being paved over without a second thought. A knock at the door shattered his trance. It was Clarence McNeil, an old neighbor, and one of the few who still remembered the original Easton property lines. He wore a tired look on his face. "Ronald, you've seen what's happening out there?" he asked. Ronald nodded slowly. "Seen it, heard it, and felt it. They're claiming it's all legal," Clarence continued, lowering his voice. "Jeanette pushed some kind of zoning approval through the county. Folks around here are under the impression you sold that land." Ronald didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch out. It was a heavy and deliberate quiet. Then, a slight smile touched his lips. "Let them think what they want," Clarence frowned. "You're not going to fight this?" "Oh, I'm going to fight," Ronald said, his voice as calm as a preacher's, just not in the way they expect. It was then that Clarence understood. Ronald wasn't powerless. He was simply biding his time as, over the next few days, the construction intensified. Trucks rumbled in and out. Cement mixers groaned from sunrise to sunset. And to the outside world, it all signaled progress. But Ronald saw it for what it was. A snare, slowly tightening around the very people who believed they were outmaneuvering him. One morning, he visited the county records office, where a woman behind the counter barely glanced up, murmuring, "Can I help you, sir?" "Yes," Ronald replied calmly. "I require copies of all property transfers and zoning updates filed within the last 12 months. Specifically," he added, "for parcel 47B. She typed a few keys, paused, and her brow furrowed. "That's peculiar. There's no transfer on file for that parcel number." Ronald nodded, having anticipated that very answer. "Thank you," he said. Offering her a courteous smile, he drove home deliberately, allowing the confirmation to sink in. No sale, no transfer, which meant every single thing happening on that land was a time bomb. One he had no intention of defusing. He just needed to let it detonate on its own. That evening, from a locked drawer, he retrieved a thick folder filled with deeds, tax receipts, survey maps bearing his father's own signature. He laid them all out across the kitchen table. The edges of the old paper seemed to glow under the solitary hanging light. This was proof, undeniable proof. He then picked up an old photograph. It was his father, standing with a shovel right at the property line. "You told me to protect what's ours," Ronald whispered to the image. "I will, but I'm going to do it my way." Outside, the bulldozers continued to rip through the earth. They were driven by deadlines and avarice. But Ronald simply observed, silent as a shadow, because he held a truth that no one else did. The very ground they were desecrating still belonged to him, and this was merely the prelude to the lesson Jeanette Rowan was about to learn. The hard way. Long before the land was ever Ronald Easton's, it belonged to a man who believed that hard work was the only path to earning respect for what you owned. That man was Ernest Easton, Ronald's father. A man whose hands were tougher than the very soil he tilled back in the mid-1960s. For a black man to own 10 acres in that part of North Carolina was more than a rarity. It was considered an impossibility. The banks turned him away, neighbors whispered behind his back, and local officials conveniently lost his paperwork on more than one occasion. But Ernest never quit. He saved every penny from factory shifts and night-hauling jobs until he had enough to purchase that plot of land, fair and square. He cleared every single inch of it by hand. There were no machines, only his own sweat, a dull axe, and unwavering faith. A young Ronald would trail behind him, barefoot, clutching a small tin lunch pail and pretending to lend a hand. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut pine and pure stubbornness. "Land doesn't just feed you, boy," his father would say. "It reminds you where you stand, especially when the world tries to push you." Ronald grew up with that principle carved into his soul, and long after Ernest passed, those words retained their power. It was precisely why he never sold, not even when developers came calling over the years, armed with glossy brochures and disarming smiles. One of them, a man by the name of Greg Yarrow, once offered him $500,000 for a mere 3 acres. Ronald had simply laughed. "You can't buy roots." Greg didn't understand. Most people never did. For years, the land remained untouched. The grass grew high, and the fence leaned just a bit. But the boundaries never once shifted. That profound silence became Ronald's solace, the kind of peace his father would have deeply understood. He honored every obligation, paid his dues promptly, and kept his ledgers immaculate, believing that certain boundaries were sacred and inviolable. That was, until Janet Rowan entered the picture. She had made her debut 2 years prior at a town hall meeting, draped in pearls and an unshakable air of confidence. Her speech was a symphony of buzzwords: revitalization, economic growth, shared spaces. From his seat in the back, Ronald had watched. He observed as she captivated the room with her polished charm, possessing a voice that could disguise even the most destructive ideas as progress. And then, the vote was called to establish the HOA's new, sweeping jurisdiction. Most of his neighbors never saw the true depth of her ambition. Ronald cast his vote in dissent, but he stood alone, hopelessly outnumbered. Even so, he never truly believed she would dare to touch his land. Then came a summer afternoon, not long before the earth movers would arrive. Ronald's sister, Charlene, had come for a visit. She was a decade his junior, making a life for herself out in Nashville. But she returned home often enough to look in on her older brother. He could still picture her leaning against the porch railing, her eyes narrowed as she gazed out at the vast, empty field. "Ever think about selling, Ronnie?" she'd asked. "This land's worth a pretty penny now." He offered her the same smile their father had always worn, a mixture of patience and stubborn resolve. "It's valuable because we held on to it," he said, "not because they've decided they want it." Charlene had simply laughed. "You always were," Daddy's echo. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he was clinging too tightly to a bygone era. But whenever he looked out at that soil, he saw the ghosts of generations standing behind him, people who started with nothing and forged an entire existence from it. They were people who were never afforded a second chance. After their conversation, Ronald found himself walking down to the property line. The ancient fence posts stood, grayed and splintered by time, yet they remained unbroken. He traced the surface of one with his fingers, feeling the familiar grooves his own father had carved into the wood. That's when his eyes caught something new. Stark white markings on the earth. Stakes, adorned with jarring orange ribbons. Survey markers. They were not there the day before. He began to follow them, one by one. His path led him to the very heart of his property, where the markings formed a cold, calculated grid, a blueprint for a future he had no part in. A cold dread settled in his stomach. Someone had been on his land, plotting and measuring, trespassing without a single word of permission. The next morning brought more. An official-looking letter arrived from the county office. It was brief, clinically polite, informing him that his unused parcel had been reclassified under a community zoning upgrade. He read the words twice, then a third time. The document was conspicuously unsigned. He dialed the number printed at the bottom. A woman's voice answered, flat and distant. Yes, Mr. Easton, the reclassification falls under the purview of the local development authority, she recited, devoid of any emotion. It's all part of the Rowan Village initiative. He asked only one question: who approved it? The president of the Homeowners Association, she replied, a Miss Janet Rowan. Ronald replaced the receiver, his movements slow and deliberate. That night, he drove to his father's grave, in the small cemetery nestled behind the old church. The moonlight caught the headstone just so, making the chiseled letters seem to glow with a life of their own. He knelt, brushing away the loose dirt from its surface. They're trying to take it, Pop, he whispered into the stillness. Everything you worked for. The wind whispered through the trees, a soft and mournful sound. He almost smiled. It felt like a response. By the time he rose to his feet, something within him had settled. The rage had subsided, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. They could build whatever they wanted. They could pave it, pour concrete, and polish it to a shine. But when they were finished, he would be waiting with the truth. He cast one last look across the open field. That night, he spoke into the darkness as if his father could hear. You built this with your hands, he said quietly. Now, I'm going to protect it with mine. However, the mastermind behind those blueprints was not a woman who yielded, and Ronald was on the verge of discovering the terrifying lengths she would go to seize what was never rightfully hers. Had you asked anyone in the neighborhood about Janet Rowan, they would have told you one thing. She was the type of person who could sell you the very ground beneath your feet and have you thanking her for the privilege. She wasn't overtly cruel, at least. Not in any provable way, but a voracious hunger for power lurked just beneath her picture-perfect smile. Janet had arrived in the area 7 years prior, straight from a high-powered corporate real estate position in Dallas, possessing a rare talent for transforming quiet communities into model developments, as she so charmingly phrased it. And the residents adored her for it. Property values soared, and the streets sparkled. Manicured flowers graced the entrance, and new rules dictated the precise height of mailboxes. On the surface, it was all deceptively benign. But Janet didn't crave order. She craved control. The moment she was elected president of the Hickory Ridge Homeowners Association, she immediately set in motion her most ambitious dream to date, the Rowan Village Center. It was a sleek commercial plaza that would, in her own carefully chosen words, bring prosperity to every member of the community. Every member, that is, except for Ronald Easton. Her vision had started modestly, with just a few retail spaces, tucked away on an unused corner of community land. But soon, the blueprints ballooned to include 12 buildings and a sprawling central courtyard. Charming cafe patios and chic boutique offices filled the pages. The layout was flawless on paper, with just a single, glaring problem. A significant portion of it trespassed onto Ronald's property. She was aware, her team was aware, and they were all betting he wouldn't notice or dare to fight back. Janet had, of course, done her homework. She knew Ronald was a solitary man who worked a part-time job at a local warehouse. He rarely, if ever, attended the HOA meetings. To her, he was just a quiet, middle-aged man, clinging desperately to an outdated family inheritance. He was, in her mind, easy to dismiss. However, during one pivotal board meeting, a young project manager named Lucas Hennon dared to raise a concern. Miss Rowan, he began, his eyes nervously tracing the architectural plans. This southern parcel appears to overlap with a private lot, owned by an individual named Easton. Are we certain this has been cleared? Janet didn't even bother to look up from her notes. It's unmaintained land, she replied with practiced smoothness. County zoning reclassified it last year. It's fine, but he tried to interject. But she silenced him with a quick smile that held no warmth and never reached her eyes. Lucas, trust me, she said. her tone condescendingly reassuring. "I've handled far bigger developments than this. If there were a problem, I would know." A heavy silence descended upon the room. No one else dared to challenge her. Janet wasn't reckless, not exactly. She simply believed, with unwavering conviction, that the rules did not apply to her. She had friends in the county office and generous donors at City Hall, not to mention a line of investors eagerly awaiting her next move. To Janet, skipping a few legal formalities was just an efficient part of the process. On the day the first bulldozer broke ground, she observed from the comfort of her silver SUV, sipping coffee from a monogrammed tumbler. "This is going to change everything," she remarked to her assistant. "People need to see progress, not get bogged down in paperwork." Her assistant hesitated. "And the Easton property?" Janet turned, her voice a soft yet razor-sharp whisper. "We'll handle it later. Once the buildings are standing, no one will even remember who owned it before." Back in her office, a converted spare bedroom, adorned with framed awards and real estate licenses, Janet meticulously rehearsed her talking points for the upcoming community meeting. Her tone was always the same, a confident, persuasive, unshakable mantra. "Growth is opportunity," she would declare. "We are forging a new space for families to thrive, for small businesses to flourish. A place where the entire community can unite." And the people would clap. They always did. She possessed a rare talent for transforming their deepest fears into thunderous applause. Yet, there was one soul she could never sway, a fact she knew intimately. Ronald Easton had been a fixture at her meetings before. He never raised an objection, never argued a point. He simply watched her, and his silence was a disquieting force. One evening, she saw him. He was seated at the very back of the community hall as she detailed the construction timeline. For a fleeting second, their eyes locked. He offered no smile, not even a blink, just a calm, certain stare. She quickly turned her attention back to the crowd. With a quick clearing of her throat, she continued, "Construction will commence next month, and by this spring, this neighborhood will be utterly transformed." As the meeting concluded and the crowd dispersed, Ronald remained. Jeanette began packing her folders. She made a point of avoiding his gaze, but his voice cut through her pretense. "Miss Rowan," he said, his tone deceptively polite, "you stated you were building on community land. Is that correct?" Her smile was a tight, forced line. "That's right. The project has received full approval." Ronald gave a single, deliberate nod. "Interesting," he remarked, "because the land you speak of has been in my family since before this neighborhood was ever conceived." A subtle twitch at the corner of her mouth was the only sign of impact. "Mr. Easton, all zoning changes were officially filed with the county. Everything is completely above board." He tilted his head, a slight, knowing gesture. "I'm sure it is. I just wanted to ensure we are both perfectly clear about whose ground you're standing on." And with that, he turned and walked away. There was no audible threat, no hint of anger, only absolute certainty. That night, Jeanette found no rest. She scrolled endlessly through documents on her laptop, and the name Easton materialized again and again on old property records, on tax maps, even in archived newspaper clippings. A frown creased her brow, but she dismissed it. "He won't do anything," she whispered into the empty room. "He never does." And yet, she could not shake the image of his placid face, of the quiet conviction that burned behind his eyes. For the very first time, she felt an unfamiliar sensation, unease. But she buried it deep beneath another spreadsheet, beneath another deadline, another glossy vision of her inevitable success. The structures rose faster than anyone anticipated. Investors beamed, and the community sang her praises once more. Jeanette strode across those half-finished sidewalks like a monarch, surveying her new empire, completely oblivious that the very man she had dismissed was meticulously documenting every single inch of it, waiting for the perfect moment to bring it all crashing down. Because Ronald was no longer just watching, he was preparing, and his profound patience was about to become her ruin. To any outside observer, it would have appeared that Ronald Easton had simply given up. He was absent from the next community meeting. He hadn't contacted a lawyer. There were no furious posts online, no protests at the construction site. He simply continued with his daily life, mowing his lawn, mending the porch railing, feeding the stray cat that appeared each morning. But within the walls of his home, a quiet war was being waged. Ronald had transformed his dining room into a space that was part command center, part historical museum. Every single document, every letter, every survey record was arranged with precision upon the table, He possessed maps of the land dating back to 1964. He had deeds notarized with his own father's signature and tax receipts for every year that followed. He wasn't merely hoarding them. As the roar of construction tore across his land each day, he sat by the window, preparing. With a notepad in hand and his phone's camera ready, he documented every truck that entered, noting their delivery times with precision. He even jotted down license plate numbers. To the builders, he was just a curious old man, but Ronald was meticulously cataloging every violation. After sunset, he would often patrol his property line, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, inspecting the fence's frayed edges. He'd pause where the bulldozers had torn through the land, scooping up a handful of soil and letting it sift through his fingers. He remembered his father's words, "This land will always speak the truth, son," especially when men try to lie about it. One Saturday morning, his neighbor Clarence approached, shaking his head in disbelief. "Ronnie, they're pouring the foundations. Are you really just going to let them build all that?" A faint smile touched Ronald's lips. "Let them," he elaborated. "Every single brick they lay only strengthens my case." Clarence's brow furrowed. "Man, you're playing with fire," Clarence warned. "No," Ronald replied calmly. "They are. I'm simply allowing them to burn their own hands." His voice was steady, devoid of any bitterness. It wasn't vengeance that fueled him, but a profound sense of clarity. Inside his home, he maintained a leather-bound notebook meticulously titled Project Rowan, where every page was dated and filled with his precise observation. He documented construction progress, transcribed overheard conversations, and saved screenshots of online listings that advertised pre-leased spaces on land that was not legally theirs. One entry read, March 18th, foundation poured for Building 4, East Corner. It now extends 17 feet into the eastern parcel. They are fully aware. They simply don't care. And he was not mistaken. Over at the site, Jeanette was proudly showcasing the progress to a group of local investors. "We're well ahead of schedule," she boasted. She strode confidently across the gravel. "The demand for commercial space in this area is simply incredible. Once this is finished, the revenue will transform this neighborhood forever." One of the investors, an older gentleman named Howard Griggs, gestured toward Ronald's house in the distance. "And what's the situation with that property over there?" he inquired. "I was told the owner refused to sell." Jeanette waved a dismissive hand. "Mr. Easton is perfectly fine. The land has been rezoned, and everything is clear with the county." Howard, however, did not appear convinced. "Still," he cautioned, "you might want to double-check that. He doesn't strike me as the type to simply roll over." Jeanette offered a tight, forced smile. "Trust me, Howard, he's completely harmless." But she was dangerously wrong. Ronald wasn't harmless. He was patient, and that is precisely what made him so dangerous. As weeks turned into months, the buildings began to materialize. Framed walls, gleaming glass panels, and freshly painted signs gave the project an air of legitimacy, of being untouchable. Jeanette held press events, inviting local news stations. She posed for photographs in front of the very first completed storefront, all for an article with the headline, "HOA President Brings New Life to Hickory Ridge." Ronald carefully clipped the article and pinned it to his wall. "New life," he murmured to himself, "built upon a grave." That evening, he sat on his porch, observing the distant, flickering lights of the construction site. He felt no hatred for Jeanette, only a deep sense of pity. He saw that she truly believed she had already won, that power and paperwork could obliterate a legacy. But she had forgotten one crucial detail. Paper could just as easily destroy her. A few days later, he arranged a meeting with a lawyer in town. Her name was Angela Poole, a property attorney who had known the Easton family for generations. She greeted him with a genuinely warm smile. "Ronald," she said, "I've been hearing things. I was wondering when you might arrive." She slid a manila envelope across the desk. It was filled with copies of the deed and tax documents. "I just need absolute certainty before I proceed," he stated as Angela began flipping through the pages. She nodded as her eyes scanned the contents. "Oh, this is more than certain. You have 40 years of uninterrupted ownership. No liens, no transfers. Ronald, they developed on private land. That isn't a clerical error. That is trespassing on $1 million scale." Ronald leaned back, a quiet confidence in his posture. "Excellent," he murmured. "In that case, I will let them finish." Angela raised a skeptical eyebrow. "You're not filing for an injunction?" "Not yet," he answered. "If I stop them now, they'll bury it quietly." I want them to complete every single inch. Let the cameras roll. Let the investors sign their checks. And let them cut that ribbon. The moment they do, I will present the deed. Angela regarded him for a long moment, then a slow smile formed. You are your father's son, he chuckled softly. That's what I'm told. When Ronald departed her office, the sky was transforming into gold. He drove past the construction site one last time. He slowed his vehicle, watching Jeanette on the property, barking orders into her phone. She never once looked his way. He rolled down his window and whispered to himself, keep building, keep digging. You're about to find out. The next morning came. He discovered a glossy flyer in his mailbox. The Rowan Village Grand Opening, June 10th. It was the date he'd been waiting for. He pinned it to the refrigerator and smiled. June 10th, he whispered to the empty room. That's when the storm arrives. But even before that day came, the cracks beneath Jeanette's carefully constructed empire were already beginning to appear, and Ronald was ready to ensure they split wide open. June 10th arrived under a brilliant, cloudless sky. It was the kind of picture-perfect day designed for cutting ribbons and shaking hands. Ronald Easton had been awake since before sunrise. He ironed his shirt with precision and polished his shoes until they shone. There was nothing hurried or anxious in his movements. He moved with the deliberation of a man who had been anticipating this very morning for a very long time. Across the road, music began to pour from rented speakers. White tents lined the sidewalks, and a red and gold banner proclaiming, "Welcome to the Rowan Village Center," fluttered between two lampposts. "A new beginning for Hickory Ridge," it read. Ronald stood on his porch, a placid expression on his face as he watched the crowd gather. City officials, investors, and local business owners, all of them smiling, all of them proud as the cameras flashed around them. News vans were parked along the curb. It was exactly the scene Jeanette Rowan had orchestrated. She stood front and center, dressed in a navy blue suit. With a microphone in hand, she greeted everyone with that polished, manufactured smile she had perfected years ago. "Today," she announced, her voice steady and rehearsed, "we celebrate progress, we celebrate community, we celebrate a vision that brings people together." Applause followed, and she basked in the sound. Ronald waited a beat longer. Before locking his front door, he retrieved a small brown folder from a table. It was thin, worn, and heavy with the truth. Then he stepped outside. As he started across the street, Clarence spotted him and whispered, "Ronnie, are you really going to do this?" Ronald gave a single, resolute nod. "It's time." He walked calmly into the crowd, unnoticed at first, until someone's eyes widened in recognition. A few people turned their heads, their voices dropping to hushed whispers. Jeanette noticed the disturbance, squinting against the morning Sunday, then went rigid when she saw him striding deliberately toward the stage. He wasn't rushing, nor did he raise his voice. He simply stood, hands clasped behind his back, as she concluded her address. "Mr. Easton," she said with a strained smile, lowering the microphone, "I certainly didn't expect to see you here." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied evenly. "After all, it's all happening on my property." A low murmur rippled through the assembled crowd as Jeanette's smile faltered. She quickly composed herself. "I beg your pardon?" Ronald held up the brown folder. "This property, parcel 47B, is still the legal possession of the Easton family. That's me. You've built all of this on land you never actually purchased." For a moment, absolute silence fell. The wind seemed to die. A cameraman zoomed in as someone in the crowd whispered, "Is he serious?" Jeanette forced a hollow laugh. "Mr. Easton, I think there has been some sort of misunderstanding. The county approved all reclassifications months ago. Without a signed transfer," he interrupted, "without consent, and without so much as a single conversation." He handed the folder to the gentleman beside her, a county inspector invited for the ceremony. "That is the original, recorded deed, notarized and updated every year since 1965. Please, take a look." The inspector's brow furrowed as he began to flip through the pages. His expression changed in an instant. Miss Rowan," he muttered discreetly. This is completely valid." Jeanette's face tightened. "That cannot be right," she snapped, reaching for the folder. The inspector pulled it back. "It is most definitely right. This document overrides any subsequent reclassification, unless a transfer or sale officially occurred." And it didn't. Audible gasps filled the air as cameras began to click incessantly. A reporter pushed forward. "Miss Rowan, did you authorize construction on what you knew to be private property?" Jeanette's mouth opened, but no words came. She turned to Ronald. "You could have stopped all of this," she hissed under her breath. He regarded her with unnerving calm. "I tried to," he stated simply. "You just refused to listen." A voice from the crowd shouted, "Wait, so all of this, these buildings, they don't actually belong to her?" The tension grew thick, like heat shimmering off asphalt. Jeanette's investors immediately started whispering amongst themselves, pulling out phones, checking their emails, as the realization dawned that millions of dollars were suddenly contingent upon one man's quiet, unyielding patience. Ronald took a step back from the podium and directly faced the cameras. "I've watched them build every wall, hang every sign, and pour every walkway," he said. "They believed they were building something new, but they were building it on top of my father's legacy. And that legacy, it still belongs to my family." There was no anger in his tone, only the simple, unshakable weight of truth. A reporter pushed closer. "Mr. Easton, what do you intend to do now?" Ronald adjusted his collar, his composure intact. "Whatever the law allows. But I will say this. My father once told me, never fight a thief while he's stealing. Let him finish, and then show him the receipt." Laughter erupted from somewhere in the crowd, nervous and awkward at first, but it spread rapidly. Even a few of the construction workers smirked, grasping the profound irony of it all. Jeanette stood frozen, her hands trembling as she turned to one of her lawyers, whispering frantically. But the cameras had already captured her raw panic, and the crowd had seen enough to know exactly who she was. Ronald turned away from the spectacle, walking back toward his home. Clarence intercepted him on the path. "Ronald, you just detonated a warhead back there," he said, a faint smile on his face. "No, Clarence, I simply pulled back the curtain." In his wake, chaos bloomed, a cacophony of frantic phone calls and heated arguments. Reporters swarmed, demanding answers from the very crowd that had lauded Jeanette just an hour before, now pressing a forest of microphones into her face. Her once perfect voice trembled as Ronald stepped onto his porch, casting one final glance over his shoulder. The golden banner, proclaiming a new beginning for Hickory Ridge, fluttered feebly in the wind. It was half ripped from its mooring. He offered no smile, no sign of triumph. He just went inside and set the folder down on his table. It landed right next to his father's photograph. "We honored it, Pop," he whispered, "just as you asked." But this was merely the first gust of the hurricane. The ensuing storm of headlines, lawsuits, and public ruin would make this initial confrontation seem like a minor tremor. And by the following morning, Jeanette's empire was set to crumble faster than those newly poured concrete walls. Hickory Ridge was no longer just a neighborhood. It had become a national spectacle, with every major local news outlet featuring the story. It was splashed across their front pages. HOA president builds on disputed land. Owner exposes deed at grand opening. $1 million blunder puts development in jeopardy. And in that instant, Jeanette Rowan's image transformed from community champion to a symbol of public disgrace. Ronald observed from his kitchen table, the television volume low, sipping coffee as news anchors dissected the event. Every single second of the footage was analyzed. There he was, projected on the screen, a picture of calm and composure. He stood resolute at the podium while Jeanette visibly floundered. The clip was already viral, and online communities had dubbed him the Quiet Avenger. He disliked the moniker. This was never about revenge. It was about honoring his father's promise. Down the road, all construction had ceased. The machinery was gone. The construction crews had been sent home, and the brand new structures, still sheathed in plastic, stood silent. A project once hailed as a triumph now resembled a modern ghost town. Meanwhile, Jeanette's phone was ringing itself into oblivion. Journalists, investors, and county officials were all clamoring for an explanation as she sat isolated in her home office. Her makeup was smudged, her hair was a mess, and she stared blankly at the dozens of missed calls. Her own assistant had resigned that morning. Even the attorney she'd retained was now refusing to proceed without a hefty advance payment. She muttered bitterly to the empty room. He waited. He waited for the cameras to be on him. He planned this whole thing. She was not mistaken. Ronald had timed his revelation flawlessly. It wasn't an act of cruelty, but a calculated move to ensure the truth could never again be swept under the rug. Later that afternoon, the official notice arrived. It was a letter from the county assessor's office, confirming in stark, legal terms that the land rights had never been transferred to the HOA. They had built illegally on private property, and the liability rested squarely on her shoulders as its leader. A cold dread seized her as she read the final line. "You are hereby instructed to cease all operations on the affected parcels pending a formal resolution." She slammed the document onto her desk and buried her face in her hands. Everything she had meticulously constructed, her reputation, her influence, her entire career had just been dismantled by a single sentence. At the same time, Ronald's lawyer, Angela Poole, was already drafting the lawsuit. This case wasn't merely about financial compensation, it was about demanding accountability from the developers, the investors, and every member of the HOA board. They were all named. When Angela called Ronald to confirm the filing, he listened in silence, and then he asked a question. "Do you believe they'll settle quickly?" "They have no choice," she asserted. "They simply can't afford for this to become a drawn-out affair. You hold the deed, the evidence, the video recordings. Everything is on your side." Ronald gave a quiet laugh. "I'm not seeking a confrontation, just fairness, Angela. I understand," she replied. "But achieving fairness often comes at a high price, and she was proven right." In less than a week, Jeanette's investors started to withdraw their support, and the entire development ground to a halt. City Hall quickly disassociated itself from her, while news outlets began excavating her previous projects, unearthing a history of zoning and funding discrepancies. The very community that had once hailed her as a visionary now demanded her removal. One evening, Ronald found himself drawn to the construction site. The sun dipped below the skeletal frames of the unfinished buildings, stretching long, dark shadows over the pavement as he moved deliberately between the structures. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of new paint and the stench of poor choices. He paused in the very heart of the plaza. It was the same spot where a ribbon was cut only days ago. Now, shredded balloons clung pathetically to the railings, and a few promotional flyers were scattered across the ground. They fluttered aimlessly in the breeze. As he stood taking it all in, a familiar voice cut through the quiet from behind him. "Mr. Easton!" He turned around. It was Jeanette. She appeared changed, diminished in some way, stripped of her polished suit and microphone. There was no entourage, only a profound sense of exhaustion. "I had a feeling you would be here," he remarked. "I had to see it one final time." She spoke quietly, her voice now devoid of its usual arrogance. "You must be relishing this." Ronald simply shook his head. "No, ma'am. There is no satisfaction in witnessing a person orchestrate their own downfall." Her eyes, red-rimmed, met his. "You could have given me a warning." "I did," he stated plainly. "You simply refused to listen." A heavy silence descended between them. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though she might break down in tears, but she didn't. Instead, she squared her shoulders. "So, what's next?" "That is a matter for the courts," he answered. "But if you mean what happens to me, nothing changes at all. I am simply holding on to what rightfully belongs to me." She gave a slow nod, biting her lip. "I truly believed I was creating something good," she murmured, almost to herself. Ronald's gaze swept over the half-completed structures. "You were trying to build it on a foundation that wasn't yours. And that is precisely why it all came crashing down." Her gaze fell to the pavement, and for the first time, she seemed genuinely humbled. "I never intended to take it away from you," she confessed. "I am aware of that," Ronald replied gently, "but good intentions do not negate the damage done." They remained there, wrapped in silence for a considerable time. Finally, Jeanette turned and began to walk away, the soft click of her heels on the pavement echoing in the quiet until she vanished down the road. Ronald cast one final glance around the plaza, a place that once represented pure arrogance, now transformed into a monument to patience and truth. Several days later, Angela's call came with the update he was waiting for. "They're settling," she announced. "Full restitution. You are regaining absolute control of the property. The development rights have been nullified." Ronald let out a long, slow breath. "Good. Let's use the settlement to heal the land, perhaps a community center. Something genuine this time." Angela's smile was audible through the phone. "Your father would have been so proud." Ronald's gaze drifted out the window, settling on the old oak tree standing at the far edge of his land. It was the same tree his father had planted half a century ago. Its leaves caught the evening light, shimmering, steadfast, and untroubled. But for Ronald, there was still one final task: to complete a promise he had held in silence for years, awaiting the perfect moment to finally give it voice. The courthouse was serene on the morning Ronald Easton put his signature on the final documents. The entire hearing had concluded in under 30 minutes. There were no raised voices, no contentious debates, only the quiet rustle of paperwork as justice settled back into its rightful place, while the judge examined the file, glanced up and stated with quiet finality, "Mr. Easton, your ownership of this property is affirmed. The court recognizes the Easton estate as the sole, legal title holder of the land in question." It was finished. Ronald showed no smile, just a slow nod as he offered his thanks to the judge. He then made his way out into the crisp morning air. As he descended the courthouse steps, the sun met his face. For a fleeting moment, it felt like his father's hand resting on his shoulder, the very hand that had once gripped a shovel, that had built fences, a hand that embodied a belief in silent strength. Outside, Angela Poole hurried to his side, clutching the official documents. "It's officially done," she confirmed. "You're in the clear. They're already dismantling the corporate entity behind the project, and the HOA is holding elections for a new board next week." Ronald accepted the papers, studying them for a long moment. "You know," he began, his voice low, "my father always said that a man's land is his memory. If you lose that, you begin to forget who you are." Angela offered a warm smile. "You didn't forget. You made certain no one else could, either." He nodded slowly. That was the entire point. They went their separate ways, and Ronald began the drive home, traveling the same road that had thundered with so much noise just weeks ago. Now, it was silent once more, peaceful, almost sacred. The half-constructed commercial plaza stood vacant, shrouded in caution tape, awaiting the arrival of demolition crews. What was once promised as the Rowan Village Center would soon be reduced to nothing but dust. He parked his truck and walked to the edge of his property line. The air was warm, still carrying the faint traces of sawdust and newly poured concrete. He stood there for a very long time, observing the sun as it descended behind the skeletal frames of the abandoned buildings. It was then he noticed a small gathering of his neighbors. Lingering by the fence, Clarence was among them, along with a few others who had once doubted him. They hesitated, uncertain whether to approach. Ronald gave a small wave, beckoning them over. Clarence was the first to find his voice. "Ronnie, we owe you an apology. We truly thought you'd just given up." A faint smile touched Ronald's lips. "You don't owe me a thing. You just needed a reminder of what patience looks like." A woman named Cheryl McBain, one of the younger residents, looked at him and admitted, "I never truly realized what this land meant to your family." His gaze shifted toward the old oak tree, its leaves rustling softly in the breeze. "It meant survival," he explained. "My father fought so that I wouldn't have to, and all I had to do was stand my ground and let time do the fighting for me." They all stood there together in the quiet, silent for a long moment as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of deep gold. "Funny thing is," Ronald continued, "everyone seemed to think progress was about new buildings. But real progress, that's about knowing your roots and refusing to let anyone pave them over." Clarence let out a small chuckle. "You ought to run for the HOA yourself." Ronald simply shook his head. "No, sir. I believe I've done enough watching for one lifetime." Later that evening, he walked to the very back of his property, to the part his father had always called the heart. He knelt beside the small wooden cross that marked where his parents were laid to rest, and placed his palm flat against the earth. "I kept it, Pop," he whispered to the soil. "They tried to build their dreams on our dirt, but I didn't let them take it from us." He remained there until the crickets began their evening song, contemplating how the smallest victories can sometimes carry the greatest weight, not because of money or land, but because of the principles they represent. When he finally rose to his feet, he took one final, long look at the land and made a decision. The following week, Ronald met with a local architect not to sell, but to rebuild. Together, they drafted the plans for something entirely new: the Eastern Community Center, a dedicated space for local families. It would be a haven for small business owners and for children who needed a place to learn about their heritage, with no fancy stores in sight. There were no overpriced boutiques, just something authentic. As word spread, the community rallied, and people offered to help. Clarence even volunteered his truck. Cheryl contributed her design skills, and remarkably, even a few of Jeanette's former supporters appeared, quietly asking if they could lend a hand. Ronald turned no one away. Months later, when the center finally opened, he stood at the entrance next to a small plaque. It was a bronze plate that read, "Built on honesty, protected by patience, dedicated to Ernest Easton." This time, there were no reporters. There were no investors or cameras, only the sound of neighbors' laughter and a few tears of joy as the crowd gathered inside. A young boy tugged on Ronald's sleeve. "Mr. Easton," he asked, "why did you wait so long before telling everyone it was your land?" Ronald smiled warmly. "Because sometimes, son, when people are busy constructing lies, it's better to let them finish. That way, when the truth finally arrives, there's nowhere left for the lie to hide." The boy considered this, nodded, and then ran off to join the other children. Ronald watched him go, feeling a deep sense of peace settle within him, a stillness that had been absent for years. He looked up toward the sky as the last light of day slipped behind the trees, and his father's words returned to him one final time. "Never fight angry, fight sure," he whispered, the words soft like a prayer. "I did, Pop. I fought sure." He then turned toward the sound of laughter spilling out of the community hall, the unmistakable sound of new beginnings on the land that his family had never truly lost. Patience is not a weakness. It is power held in silence until the truth has nowhere left to run. If you believe in standing for what's right, even when no one is watching, subscribe for more stories that remind us how truth, faith, and time will always emerge victorious in the end.